Okay, so we are in what the school calls Old Testament 2, and thank you. And we are going to study some books of the Bible that that are found in the latter half of your Old Testament. Now, in my opinion, the Old Testament should be arranged in terms of the order of the books, the way that they are arranged, the books are arranged in your Hebrew Bible. So once you take Hebrew in this school, you'll purchase a Hebrew Bible, and the books will be put in the Law, Prophets, and Writings order. And the reason I think this is important is because every indication that we have tells us that this is the way that Jesus mentally organized the books of the Old Testament. In other words, the technology, Jesus was probably dealing with scrolls. And then the early Christians dealt with these things called codexes. A codex being, come on in guys, come right down to the front. A codex being a book like what we have, where you have these sheets of paper that are joined together at the back, at the end here, and then you open it like this as opposed to unrolling a long sheet of paper. Scroll technology had not yet progressed to the point where they could get the whole of the Old Testament onto one scroll. That's a massive achievement. That's a huge scroll, right? And you're going to have a certain thinness of paper and the ability to write pretty small in order to accomplish that feat. Eventually, scroll technology got there, but at the time of Jesus, they just had individual scrolls for individual books. Nevertheless, there was most likely, every indication indicates, there was a mental organization or an order of the books of the Old Testament. And we see this reflected in Luke 24 when Jesus says in verse 44, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms," Psalms being like an umbrella term for all the writings, "everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." So you've got that statement from Jesus. You've also got this statement that Jesus makes, depending on which gospel you're looking at. You find him saying things like, from the blood of all the martyrs. This is Luke 11, verses 49 and 50. "Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world," and we think of Abel being killed in the book of Genesis, "from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation," verse 51, "from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary." So Jesus makes that statement, and Zechariah, his martyrdom is recounted in the book of Chronicles, which is at the end of the Old Testament in this organization of the books. So if you put Chronicles out of order, you don't feel the force of what Jesus is saying, which is that the blood of the martyrs across the Old Testament, these people are going to be held accountable for that. So in the law, you've got the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So I'll just put GN for Genesis through DT for Deuteronomy. In the prophets, let me also say, this way of mentally organizing the books of the Old Testament is vastly easier than the way that we have in our English Old Testament. And let me also say that the organization in our English Old Testament, your English translation of the Old Testament, is nothing more than a modern printing convention. In other words, when they invent the printing press, Gutenberg, 1450s or whatever, they start printing Bibles, they've got to pick an order. And they picked this order, and everybody's stuck with it. But it's not an order that's older than that. This is not some kind of Christian order of the books of the Old Testament, because when you look at the earliest Christian Bibles that have the Greek translation of the Old Testament and the Greek New Testament all in one codex, all in one book, the order of the books in the Old Testament in those Greek versions of the whole Bible don't match each other. And they don't match this order that we have in our English Old Testaments. So I think that this order of the Old Testament is just a convenience that people have adopted. But this order that I'm telling you about, it seems to be the order that Jesus assumed. And as followers of Jesus, I think we ought to want to follow it this way. Think about the Bible the way He did. That's what I want to do. I want to think about the Bible the way that Jesus taught His apostles to think about the Bible. And it seems, from the way that that passage in Luke 11 reads and that passage in Luke 24 reads, it seems that Luke assumed nobody would need this to be explained to them because everybody would understand it. Everybody would understand that Zechariah is murdered in Chronicles, and Chronicles is last in order, and so I don't need to go into an explanation of what Jesus is talking about there. So you've got Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then you've got two sets of four in the prophets. You've got what are referred to as the former prophets, and then the latter prophets. The former prophets are books that we would refer to as histories, and they call them prophets because the idea is anyone who writes a book of the Bible is prophetically inspired. And so in the former prophets, you have Joshua, Judges, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel counting as one, and Kings. So four books of history there. Ruth goes over in the writings. She doesn't belong here in the prophets. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Four former prophets, and then the latter prophets are four books of what we would call prophets. So you've got Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12. The 12 being the 12 minor prophets, and they're treated as one here because all indications were that in the ancient world they were treated as one book. So you've got four books of history, four books of prophecy. These are the prophets, the former and latter prophets. And then in the writings, you have a collection of books. And the writings, there is some variation in the order of the writings. But if you go back before, say, about 1000 A.D., the orders of the writings shrink. And there are just a few different ways in which these books are ordered. I'm going to present to you the order that I have in this. I have this Diglot Hebrew-English version of the Old Testament, and I'm just going to put up on the board the order of the writings that are here. This is not necessarily the oldest order, but it's the order in which I think about the books. So you've got Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. That's a set of three. And these are sort of wisdom books, aren't they? Books that are reflecting on life, doing kind of commentary on the Old Testament. And then you have what are referred to as the 5 small scrolls. These are 5 small books. The word for small scrolls in Hebrew is megillot. So sometimes you'll hear these referred to as the megillot. And these 5 small scrolls, I think, are strategically organized. So what you have is, I'm going to write these up as a chiasm because I think it helps to remember them. You have the Song of Songs, and so that's Israel's best song. And that's going to be matched by Israel's worst song, which is Lamentations. And actually, I did this out of order. Sorry. Let me back up. We'll see if this works. All right. First, we've got Ruth. Ruth. And Ruth is matched by Esther. And these are unique books in the Old Testament, aren't they? They're unique in that they have female main characters, Ruth and Esther. And you can compare and contrast Ruth and Esther in that Ruth is a foreign woman coming into the land of Israel. Esther is an Israelite in a foreign land. And then there are similarities, aren't they, where they both wind up married. They both, in a sense, signal deliverance for the people of Israel. Ruth being in the line of Messiah, and then Esther interceding with the king to spare the lives of the people. So you've got Ruth and Esther, and then you've got the best song, Song of Songs, and the worst song, Lamentations. And then in the middle, you've got this book of Ecclesiastes, which is unique also in the Old Testament. It's unique also in these books in that Song of Songs features this bride of the king who is this wonderful lady, and she's this ravishing bride, and they have this great relationship. Lamentations features the city of Jerusalem as this matron who has been shamed and her children have been slain. So Jerusalem is personified as a woman in Lamentations. Ecclesiastes then is unique among these 5 small scrolls in that there isn't a kind of woman, female main character in Ecclesiastes. It's just the sage, Kohelet, the preacher, reflecting on life. So you have the 5 small scrolls, and then after that, you have a kind of return to history as you go into Daniel. And then there are ways that we'll look at, Lord willing, as we get there later in the semester. There are ways in which the narrative of Daniel is picked up and continued in Ezra and Nehemiah. So I'm just going to put E-N for Ezra and Nehemiah because, again, in the ancient world, they were regarded as one book. And then it finishes off with Chronicles. So there's your Old Testament, and arranged according to law, prophets, and writings. Now, looking at this, let's just reflect on this for just a moment. You have a long historical narrative here, if you approach the books this way, that begins in Genesis and continues all the way to the end of Kings. And if we just reflect on that narrative for a moment, we begin in the Garden of Eden at creation, and we end with the people of Israel being driven out of the land of promise. The temple has been destroyed and the people have been exiled. So there's this long historical narrative. And then when we come into the latter prophets, what we find is that all of these guys are in essence commenting on that historical narrative. So I think that arranging the books this way helps us to see the relationship between the books. Because what Isaiah is addressing is the situation in Kings. What Jeremiah is addressing is the situation in Kings, and they're assuming everything that's gone before in the Old Testament as they do this. And then, similarly, these books are all meant to be read as commentary on, poetic and prophetic commentary on the narrative of Israel's history, the history of God's work in the world and in the nation of Israel. And so you have this commentary that begins in Isaiah and continues really through Lamentations or Esther. Esther is a little bit of a return to history. And then at the end of the narrative, you pick back up with, or at the end of the Old Testament, you pick back up with a return to historical narrative. So it's like you've got a long historical narrative, then a long set of commentary on the historical narrative, and then you return to historical narrative with a forward-looking outlook. And even as you do this, what this sets you up to see is that a book like Chronicles is in many ways a summary and interpretation of the whole story. And it's a summary and interpretation after the exile has happened in Kings and the return from exile has been narrated for you in Ezra and Nehemiah. So it puts Chronicles, it puts us in position to understand Chronicles where the author of Chronicles, I think, understood himself to be making his contribution. Namely, he's writing to people who have returned to the land after exile, and he's interpreting for them the whole of God's dealings with Old Testament Israel.